it's not only appropriate to begin topically and for the sake of Mangala, but because it's in some ways one of the verses that brought me to the current topic that I'm talking about today, and that has in many ways guided how I approach and how I wish to study Pāṇinian or Sanskrit grammar in general, and Pāṇinian grammar in particular. And so the question is, why is this verse interesting? I think many people know it, but it's interesting because if we try to actually situate it in time and space, it's rather more difficult. It's a verse that is quoted. If we try to go back in time, we might get to it today. In Haradatta Miśra's commentary, the Padamañjarī, to the Kāśikāvṛtti, but it is also transmitted and probably originally so in manuscripts at the beginning of Dharmakirti's Rupavatara. So this would be a Buddhist grammar, Pāṇinian grammar, the first one of the Kāumudī style, dating probably to the 10th, 11th century. So why is it there? Why is it in the context of Dharmakirti that we find it for the first time? And so people like Madhav Deshpande in particular have written more about sort of the context of grammar. So there's this article, Who Inspired Pāṇini? And I think this has very much been an inspiration to me to understand how grammars were kind of used, not simply to make correct Sanskrit or to judge Sanskrit, but also to, there are also ways that people were situating themselves in various religious affiliations, cultural milieus, and things like that. So grammar, of course, was integral to the study of Sanskrit, but it is sort of a much larger and messy field of study than is perhaps initially believed to be from first impressions and from what we perhaps read in various introductory works to Sanskrit and to Sanskrit grammar. And so another sort of inspiration for me for this topic of sort of how Sanskrit grammar was introduced at various points in time was when, and I'm going to start sharing my screen now, was when I was looking through old European grammars of Sanskrit. So this is the first one that was kind of published in English. Maybe the name is certainly, the author is probably known to most of you. This is Colebrooke, his grammar of 1805. And what was really fascinating to me when reading through this and reading Colebrooke's works in general is, of course, his vast erudition that he had and simple knowledge of Sanskrit texts at a time where, of course, nothing was published and all of this was in manuscript form. But also how he sort of talks about Sanskrit grammars and how he talks about authorities for his grammar, and as we'll see in a second, how other people talked about authorities for their grammars at the time. So we have maybe this one little sentence, other authorities. So we have Pāṇini to begin with, we have Katyayana, we have Patañjali. These are all well known. There are three saints, this is the Muni Trayam. And then he says, other authorities may be admitted where they are silent, but a deviation even by a classical or ancient writer from a rule in which they concur is deemed either a poetical license or a privileged barbarism. So this poetical license is something that we will return to shortly. He goes on to talk more about his various sources. I note in particular that he talks about Haradatta Miśra in particular in his Padamañjarī. He talks, of course, about the Śabdakaustubha of Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita and his massive, this is the Prayojanas commentary on that. And I also note too that he cites another work that we'll be talking about, the Prakriyākaumudī, and its commentary, two commentaries, the Prasada and the Tattva Chandra. And this, as we'll see in a second, is actually an abbreviation, it seems, of Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa's Prakāśa. Okay, so he goes on, but even more impressive if we keep going, if you haven't seen it before, it's worth looking at, are his list of Sanskrit grammars with commentaries. So we're on page 9, and he has, and this he says in the introduction as well, that these are works that he has had access to, that he has some kind of manuscript of, or that he knows in good authority that they exist. He has an absolutely tremendously long list of Pāṇinian works. This is the Tattva-chandra that I mentioned, which is an abridgment from one Krishna Pandit. This is no doubt Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa. He has a tremendously long list of works, some of which are not, I believe, published up to this day. This is just the Pāṇinian school. And then he goes on to list even more grammars from the non-Pāṇinian schools. So all of the Saraswata grammatical tradition, Hemachandra's grammar, the Katantra grammars, the Samkshipta of Kramishwara, that is the Jaumara school as well. The Mukta Bodha of Vopadeva, someone else we will mention a little bit. And really, I mean, it's just an incredibly impressive list. So one of the things that this, reason why it's sort of, I mentioned it here, is that it really, while I was doing sort of PhD work, made me wonder, well, what are all of these grammars? I'd never heard any of these grammars. Do they matter? Were they important? Were they just sort of regurgitating the same thing that we find in Pāṇini in slightly different ways? Were they important for the people that were writing Sanskrit? Did it influence how people wrote or understood the language? So all of these questions came up for me quite some time ago, and I've sort of tried, although not always as thoroughly as I would have liked, to understand these different grammars at different points in times. And one of the ways we can do that is by reading closely the opening sections to these grammars. And so many of them have quite long introductions. They're very long introductions, for example, to the Katantra. They're very long introductions in some of the commentaries, in the commentaries to the Katantra, in the commentaries to the Mukta Bodha, Vopadeva's grammar, and so on. So this is sort of developed into a bit of a project for me to really read these introductions and see how, what they have to say. How well do they fall in line with somebody like Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita's stance on grammatical authority, or somebody like Nagesha? How much or how little have things changed in the course of time? And so the other one that I just wanted to, this is another one by, I believe was actually maybe finished before Colebrooke's grammar, but that was then published later. I believe he even regrets that he published it because Colebrooke's is so much better than his. But he, once again, mentions sort of his grammatical authorities. And he does so, but he mentions first and foremost, not Pāṇini. So this is at the beginning of the 19th century. He mentions Vopadeva, he mentions this Kramishwara, then he mentions Pāṇini. And he goes on to mention other sort of commentaries and the Samkshipta grammar that we saw before. So the way that people were learning grammar was quite different, especially in the, this Bengal region where the British or the East India Company had its outpost to begin with. And indeed, if you read about what people were studying at the time, so if you read into some of these catalogs and such, you'll see repeated statements that Pāṇinian grammar was not well known in certain regions, that they only used Vopadeva, and so on and so forth. So the sort of reality on the ground, how people were learning Sanskrit was very different over the course of time. And this is something that has kind of fascinated me, and I wanted to know more about it. And so one of the ways that I would like to do that is by studying these introductions and hopefully in the near future publishing something on this topic. And so that's just sort of how I wanted to give you an idea as to how I came to be doing this particular project. And we will now move to the handout. I think, so everyone has received this from me. I think there was a rather late version was sent out with a few more corrections here or there. There might still be a few more corrections, as there always are. But hopefully it's in relatively good shape at this point. So as I mentioned, there were 3 authors initially that I wanted to look at, and now I've sort of whittled that down to 2. And there are 2 authors that I think are very important within the Pāṇinian tradition. And there are 2 authors that, though they have, at least Haradatta has received some attention in scholarship, and he is generally mentioned when you read, okay, even on technical subjects, Haradatta always sort of comes up. But he's one that's really perhaps not been as thoroughly studied as he could have been. And certainly these opening verses that we have by him, and also the entire introduction, so it goes after the verses, he goes into sort of his own kind of mini Paspaśā introduction, as Patañjali has. This really has not been looked at very closely, and there's quite a lot that we can learn about his take on grammar. I hope we will be able to get to that at some point. But I would like to kind of go through the material in the handouts first, and then if you've seen the handout and you've seen what we will read, after we go through these verses and the material in the handout, then we can jump into perhaps some of the prose portions that I wanted to look at. So who is Haradatta Miśra? Why does he matter? Well, as we saw already, Colebrooke mentions him as being one of the great authorities and having written a rather profuse and extremely long technical commentary on the Kāśikāvṛtti. So we know that he's basically from sometime in the 12th, maybe 13th century. He's definitely from South India. We have many indications of this, words that he uses to gloss Sanskrit words. There are some that appear to are very clearly Telugu or Tamil words. We know also from references to many of his other works. So if you don't know Haradatta Miśra from grammar, you very well may know him from sort of legal texts or Grihya Sutra texts. So he wrote, I think we have at least 5 commentaries by him on Apastamba Grihya Sutra, Apastamba Dharma Sutra, Apastamba Mantra Pata. He has a commentary, Gautama Dharma Sutras, and the Ashvayana Grihya Sutra. So he was a quite prolific writer, and he is one that we can learn quite a bit about, even if we don't have sort of this firsthand account of his life and so on. And we can situate him basically by who knows him afterwards. So within grammar, you can read more about this in Kane. I've given you references. But in terms of grammar, it seems that he knows quite well the Pradipa of Kayata, although he doesn't ever quote it by name. So that sort of puts him after the 11th century. He is quoted really for the first time by Sayanacharya in his Madhya Dhatu Vritti. So that also gives us kind of a limit for when he must have existed prior to. And yeah, so he then basically becomes one of the main staples for later grammarians. So when people like Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa and Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita and Agisha, he's consistently mentioned in their commentaries, and when they discuss grammatical debates, Haradatta is usually pops up here and there. He's quite important for the Pāṇinian tradition because if we remember a lot of this stuff that was going on with like the Vākyapadīya, with Kayata's study of the Mahābhāṣya, this was taking place in Kashmir, so Helaraja, Kashmir, Kayata, Kashmir. And Haradatta is the one of the first ones from really kind of the deep south, I guess, that is then incorporating all of this material into his commentary on the Kāśika. So he takes a number of, it seems verbatim passages from Kayata's Pradipa and repeats them almost on every page. You can find very close parallels. The Vākyapadīya is quoted profusely. I think they're well over 100 verses. And we also kind of learn quite a bit about him as sort of a personality. So he's definitely very confident in his learning. And I've sort of given you just a couple of these verses that I found, or have found with the help of other secondary literature, that give us an idea of what kind of erudition he has and how he presents that. So the first one that I give you is this this one here. So this is coming from the end of 113, so right at the beginning of the grammar. So it says, Evam praketos mabhir bhāṣyem parichaya para tasya nisheshato manye pratipatti dorlabha. So thus, we have displayed our exceptional familiarity, or really the best parichaya with in the Mahābhāṣya, though one who can really understand it, pratipatta, would be in its entirety, nisheshataha, would be, I believe, incredibly difficult to find. I sort of sometimes wonder if the tasya is rather ambiguous. Maybe it can certainly refer back to the bhashya, but also perhaps to his own parichaya, his own familiarity with the Mahābhāṣya. Another one that's quite nice. So this is also just so as always, commentators like to show off a bit all of their full erudition at the beginning of the work. So once again, at at the end of 114, we have another verse that he says, Prakriyātarka gahana pravishto hrishta manasa haradatta hari swairam virahan kena varyate. So who can stop Haradatta, the lion, who has entered deep into the reasoning behind derivations with an ecstatic mind, from amusing himself as he likes. Swairam viraham. So importantly, at least in the first one, the Mahābhāṣya, Mahābhāṣya, is particularly mentioned out. So this will be a recurring theme. And once again, in the third one, we have some reference to the Mahābhāṣya. Charitat pratipadyantam bhāṣe krita parishrama nanye sahasram apyanda soryam pashyanti nanjasam. In matters such as this, those who have greatly labored in the bhashya may understand that others. Blind men, though they number 1,000, never truly see the sun. So this is his commentary on 216, a bit later on. But nevertheless, it gives the same idea that to sort of understand all of the fine points of Sanskrit grammar and to understand his own commentary that he is writing, it is necessary to have this very deep understanding, to really put a lot of effort into studying the Mahābhāṣya. So as I said, his opinions are quoted later on as an authority, or sometimes he's disputed, of course. But he is definitely someone who is on the scene, and definitely one that we should have read if we wish to understand the Pāṇinian tradition. So another thing that really interests me in sort of Sanskrit grammar and in its development over the course of time is how it responds to ongoing Sanskrit usage. So unlike many of the other classical grammatical traditions in Arabic or in Persian, Latin or Greek, Sanskrit's in a rather interesting, from our vantage point at least, of the text that we have, Sanskrit's in this rather interesting position that Pāṇini's grammar, in terms of when we see it being used, is being used for literature written after the grammar. So we do have Sayana and other people applying Pāṇini to Vedic texts and sort of judging Vedic texts on the basis of Pāṇini. But in the Greco-Latin tradition, the grammars are really written after we have sort of these major, especially poetic authors like Virgil and so on. But in the Sanskrit tradition, it's kind of the other way around. Pāṇini predates, by several centuries at least, the great poets, Kalidasa. So it's interesting to see how commentators on the Ashtadhyayi and how other authors of new grammars are taking into account usages that seem to be problematic for particular interpretations of the Ashtadhyayi. So possibly taking a cue from works like the Durgata-vritti. Okay, I don't know if Haradatta knows the Durgata-vritti. This is maybe not possible. But he certainly knew of other texts that took into account poetic usage. We have a number of, from Alankara Shastra as well, we know that there were discussions going on about grammatical correctness in the works of the great poets. So he generally will take up these forms when they seem to be problematic. He'll maybe offer a solution, or he maybe will not. Nevertheless, we find a number of where Haradatta expresses the opinion that poets more or less can go their own way. And so I've given you a few examples that I've sort of come across here and there. It would be really nice if we had eventually at some point a full list of all of the quotations that Haradatta uses. We have some articles that look into some of them, but a real complete list is still, I think, not quite there. At least I've managed to find some that were not yet reported. So the first one that I give here is an example from the Kumara Sambhava. And he's discussing, so this first one here, he's discussing a sutra 1452. This is Gati Buddhi Pratyavasanata and so forth. So this is a sutra that deals with when the instigated agents, that is to say, the agent of the non-causative form of a verb can be called karman, can be called the direct object, and therefore take the accusative. Usually we would want to have with karayati or pachayati or something, an instrumental for that agent. But this sutra by Pāṇinian allows it to be the karman and hence in the accusative. And so he's discussing this rule, and he has just come from quoting a Vakyapadiya verse that talks about the fact, more or less, that the agent, the original non-caused, non-instigated agent is still the agent, although it's sort of the direct object of the prayojana, of the causation. And he has just quoted this verse, and now he comes to a problematic verse that he knows from Kalidasa. And Bhartrhari has also talked about this swadharma, that the third case, that is the instrumental, is still going to be used with after the agents, because it still retains its own dharma of being an agent with respect to its own subordinate action, gunakriya. And so the problem is that this list of exceptions that we have in the sutra, so verbs of thinking, verbs of consuming, verbs of motion, these types of verbs where we can have the accusative, they don't include necessarily, at least directly, a verbal action like gra. Kalidasa nonetheless has used the causative of gra with this sort of double accusative construction. So the verse says that, this is probably familiar to many of you from the Kumara Sambhava, that Adari, so we're talking about Himalaya, Parvati's father, he was not able to make Shiva Devadevam, who was not, he was not interested in being a suitor. He was not a willing participant in this. He was not able to make him take his daughter, that is to say, to take her up in marriage. And so Haradatta's response to this, the initial one is, well, okay, swatantraha kavaya. So poets are independent. They're independent of sort of grammatical rule. He then goes on, as he does in some of these, to offer an alternative explanation. And okay, we don't need to, the explanation is rather quite straightforward. And the idea is simply that if we think of gra as not being, okay, maybe to grasp or something, but it has this idea of bodhayatum. We can gloss it with make him think. So he was not able to make him think about his daughter with regard to the domain at all, think of his daughter with regard to the domain of udvaha, of marriage. And this is how we should explain the verse. Iti evam vyākyayam. And then we get, okay, the explanation. So the form is established here because it has as its meaning buddhi. So it falls within the domain of Pāṇini's rule. We don't need to necessarily go through the other two, but once again, both of these, this is from the Kiratarjuniya. So that actually they work quite nice if you think of Kalidasa, Kiratarjuniya, Bhadavi, and then the Shishupala of Magha. Once again, we get this idea that there is a grammatical fault with Meru Mahi Brittaha. This has to do with the idea that when we have Meru, basically, nothing is added to Meru by saying mountain after it. And this type of compound is discussed and prohibited. And going back to the Mahābhāṣya, as sort of being a redundancy, Meru can only be a mountain. And therefore, Meru never leaves off, never abandons his mountainness. Okay, so therefore we should not form the compounds. But poets, once again, are near Amshipam, right? So they're sort of, I guess, something like unfettered or unhinged. We can't control them. The last example, dealing with Padasmaipata endings, I've sort of talked about this in length in another place. He has some difficulty with getting the Padasmaipata and Udayati. And then he says, well, what's the point of trying to cleanse, to wash this wild elephant? So there's no use in really dealing. You can't try and control somebody like Magha. I think this should be Shalachena maybe. But then he goes on to give two alternatives. So this is kind of his approach to poetry, or to poetic usage that is sort of outside normal grammatical interpretation. He can say, okay, we can't really control poets. There's no use in trying to tame them. They're going to do what they want. But on occasion, he does go and then offer alternative explanations. I've left them out here for the sake of time. But importantly, he doesn't, I mean, what does this say about their authority? Are we happy about it? Are we unhappy about it? It's just a fact of life. He, I think, would like them to follow it. I mean, he's not saying that they're really correct Sanskrit. He would perhaps like them to follow, but they don't. Okay, and they're great, so it's sort of okay. Interestingly, though, when he comes to quotations from Smriti, Itihasa texts, Puranic texts, here he's more willing to say things like Chandavat Ureshaya Kordavanti. So when he has this issue with Patal in this verse, which is possibly from the Narada Smriti, then he's willing to say that these are sages and that they can compose, as it were, maybe in Vedic Sanskrit. So they're willing, he's willing to give them the poetic, or not poetic license, but the license of being a rishi. So this Arsha Prayoga, which many people have talked about, or some people have talked about in the past. He does not, to my knowledge, ever say anything like this for Kalidasa, or for Magha, or for Bhadavi. So that's sort of some of the things that interest me about the Padamañjarī and about Haradatta Miśra. So this incorporation of usage, of actual Sanskrit usage into this commentary on the Kāśikāvṛtti, and also how, well, we'll see other ways as to how he sort of sets up Sanskrit theoretically within with relation to the Paspaśā of Patañjali, and how he approaches what Sanskrit is and how it should be regulated. So now I guess we should turn to the reading parts. I don't know how we want to do question and answers. I think maybe since we have kind of two authors that we're dealing with, we'll kind of go through Haradatta, and then when we're done with Haradatta, we can come back and take some questions. I don't know if that's good with Lydia.
That is perfect. Yes, yes, thank you.
Yeah. I think there may be already questions. I've been seeing the chat light up, but it might be best to wait till the end to take any questions. So in terms of the text of the Padamañjarī, as always, in terms of the text of the Padamañjarī, it was sort of published serially in the Pundit, this famous magazine or famous periodical, and it where the Kāśikāvṛtti was also published. And this edition basically has been taken as the basis for the subsequent editions. There are a couple of them. I've given you reference. You can download them in any of these archive or from my own files in the Google Drive folder. But they've all kind of more or less used the same text of the Pundit as the foundation. I've looked at some manuscripts of the Padamañjarī, and it is actually none very old, but it does seem to be fairly well established. We'll see a few variants in the text of the verses that we have, but for the most part, it's fairly well established, I think, although, of course, we should always try to go back and see if we can improve the text. I've also had a look at some of these other catalogs, which you can see on archive, and they also have basically the same variants that are reported in the Pundit. Yeah, and so finally, of course, these verses have also been translated. This is also one of the papers that I found very, or something that I wanted to imitate. I think J.F. Rudbergen had translated the introductory verses to the Kāśika itself, as well as the introductory verses to Jinendra Bodhi's Nyasa, as well as the Haradatta's Padamañjarī. I think there may be some things we could change with the translation, but they're there, and we can also take his interpretation into account. So I guess, I mean, it's supposed to be a Sanskrit reading room, which would perhaps mean that this should be interactive, but I think we've kind of, we're now not making it so interactive. I don't know if Lydia, if we wanted to offer volunteers for translation, or.
I personally think that with 61 people in the room, it might be a bit difficult to try to sift through volunteer requests.
Yeah.
I think that unfortunately the traditional reading room experience would be limited to a 12-person Zoom meeting, not much more. So I think for at least this session, we're going to rely on your previous work with the text as well.
Okay, good. And then, but then afterwards, I think once we get to the end of it, we can then ask for.
Yes. So please do use. I put in chat. I put the Slido link in chat. So if you have any questions on this particular section afterwards, please put your questions there, and we'll get to them.
Yeah. So these are the opening verses, and they are written in kavya meters, as you can see. We have a number of nice kavya meters. They're somewhat elaborate in their construction. They're not nearly as elaborate as we'll see from Śeṣa Krishna, but they still are somewhat programmatic insofar that they set out his sort of religious affiliation. They set out some information about his parentage. They give us some ideas about what he thinks about other commentaries. And he ends with a quite nice mention of a Mangala that will also be known, I think, to many of you who have studied grammar. And I've given you some notes about this in the notes, which you've maybe already looked at. So I guess we'll just start with the first one. So he begins with Vasanta Tilaka, Vyakta Pradana Purushatmakam, Aswatantram etat samastam, Aditishtati yaswatantraha, Tasmai Shivaya Paramaya, Dashavyayaya, Sambhaya Sadaram Ayam, Vihitaf Pramanaha. So an obeisance has been made. This obeisance has been made respectfully to that Shiva, the supreme the one who is maybe something like has 10 immutable qualities, or is immutable with respect to 10 qualities, together with Amba, with Parvati. He who is independent, svatantraha, as he lords over, as he is in charge of etat samastam, all of this, that is the known universe, that is asvatantra, right? That is not independent, that is under his control. And then I believe we have here a fairly clear, as I put in the notes, a fairly clear reference to the opening of the Sankhya Karika. So the Sankhya Karika begins with Vyaktam tata pradhanam tadviparitas tata cha puman. So the Vyakta, the individuals, the Pradhana, and then the material, and then the Purusha. Well, if you're familiar with Sankhya philosophy, I think that this will be quite clear reference. And so this is what the known universe is made up of. The Dashavyaya, this is also seems to be something that we can elaborate on. There are various lists of the 10 qualities of Shiva. Usually I've given these in the in the footnote as well. Jnana, Vairagya, Aishvarya, Tapas, Satya, Kshama, Dhritti, Srishtatva, Atma Sambodha, Adishta Tritva. And I've given you some other references that we have, for example, from the Tattva Sangraha, and Kamala Shila also has a number of explanations for the individual powers as well. So we get a nice salutation, obeisance, and we get Haradatta's affiliation with Shaivism. The next one will be to that Vastu Hasti Mukham, this sort of reality, true thing, the Vastu that has the elephant face. So this, of course, is Mangala Charana to Ganesh. Swam swam manoratam avaptum apeta vignam yasya prasadam anavapya na shaknuvanti padmasana prabhrita pratamepi devas tadvastu haste mukhamastu mayi prasannam. So may that elephant-faced vastu, thing, reality, be kind, propitious towards me, without obtaining whose grace, favor, not even the foremost of the gods, beginning with Brahmadeva, are able to obtain their individual desires without desires that are free of obstacles. So I think rather standard Mangala Charana for Ganesh. So the gods themselves are not able to achieve their results without impediments if they do not have the favor of Ganesh. I think that's fairly straightforward. So the next one, I think syntactically, they basically more or less go together. Well, we get some information, we get some information about Haradatta's family. So we get some idea of who his father, or at least a name of his father, his mother, as well as his elder brother, and then teacher. So usually, although syntactically we have the cha, most people seem to take the elder brother as being one, and then we have the teacher as another one. Okay, so the verse, and then I think we have to read it in conjunction with the following one syntactically. So tatam padma kumarakyam pranam yambam shriyam tata jyeshtam chagni kumarakyam acharyam aparajata. So having bowed down to my father named Padma Kumara. So in the notes I've given you here, this is one of the places where we have some variants. I believe we have Rudra as the alternative reading. We can double check. Yes, Rudra Kumara Aryam. So that's one variant that we find dating back to the Pandita that is also available in these manuscript catalogs. So he bows down also to Amba, to his mother Shri, and his older brother named Agni Kumara. And then if we take the teacher as another one, then that would be Aparajita, would be the name of his teacher. So generally they take this as being, other people have taken this as being 4 individuals. So this was sort of absolutive, and then we move into the main sentence of the 2 verses. Yashchiraya Haradatta Sanyaya Vishruto Dashasu Dikshu Dakshana Ujjahara Padamañjarī Asau Shabdas Sahakara Padapat. Sorry. So that Haradatta, who, okay, having done that, is well-known, famous, the southerner, or skillful one, in the 10 directions. What is he well known as? How is he well known? Under the name of Haradatta for some time. He has plucked from, I think we want Shabda Shastra, maybe there's an issue there. He has plucked this cluster of words, so Padamañjarī is something like a flower cluster of words from the tree, the mango tree that is grammar. Was trying to see if there was a nice Pāṇinian explanation for using the perfect. I don't know if it, we really have Prakāśa lit, but maybe we can discuss that later. Maybe somebody already has an answer. Okay, so now we get a little bit, we have sort of his family issue, we have mention of the text, we have sort of a simile with the way that why he has called it the Padamañjarī. And now we get a little bit about what kind of people would be willing to receive his work, praise his work. So Tam Imam, so we're referring back now to the Padamañjarī. Tam Imam Anupadena Chetasa Bhavyantu Bhuvi Bhavya Buddhaya Kakkalu Praniyani Priyam Vade Matsari Bhavati Madvidhe Jane. So may people that have really developed excellent, praiseworthy minds, may they praise, cherish this work of mine, Tam Imam, with a mind that is, well, maybe something like honest, without having any sort of coverings upon it, upadhis upon it. Who, pray tell, would be a jealous man with respect to me, a man like myself, who is affectionate and who says, speaks kindly. And so next we get to the point where he talks more about well, how they should, what other commentaries. So we always generally get some sort of reference back to earlier commentaries, and now we get one that he sort of talks about why his commentary in particular is good. Avicharitaramanyam kamam vyakyashatam bhavatu vrite tridayangama bhavishyati gunagrihyanam iyam vyakyam. So let it be that let there be 100 commentaries on this vritti, on the Kāśikāvṛtti, I understand. They would be pleasing Ramaniya, I believe, to people who perhaps are vicharita, people who lack sort of this discrimination and judgment. My commentary, this commentary, Iyam Vyākya, it will go to the heart, that is, it will really be pleasing, Hridayangama. It will really be pleasing to those who are guna grahyanam. And so I've given you a note on this word guna grahya. I believe many of you would recognize it, perhaps from the Kiratarjuniya. And this is actually maybe showing a bit of a rather learned Pāṇinian usage with this word grihya. And it sort of means something like people who are partial to, or people who are really only going to judge according to the merits. So if you look at the Kiratarjuniya passage, it also has to do with this idea of people judging a speech more or less based on its, only on its merits. So my commentary is really going to please those people who are primarily focused on judging a work on the basis of its merits. And now we come to 7. This is the one, these two sort of taken together, deal with the issue of there being, not being a namaskara at the beginning of the Kāśikāvṛtti, and also not at the beginning of Pāṇini's sutras, or the Bhāṣyas, or the Bhāṣya, or the Vartikas. So he says, Ishtadeva namaskara karya sanneha kim krita vritta sutre tatha bhashye vartike cha paruchite manasa vachasa chakarmana krita evayam ehana vishita nahi dharba pavitra pani tad yaparam mangalam atra kirtate. So why, since a homage, obeisance to the worshipped deity, since it is something that must be done, why has it not been done here? In the vritti, in the sutra, as well as in the Bhāṣya and the Vartika. I think to this we say that indeed this has been done here with mind, with speech, and with action, without maybe really placing it here physically in writing. For there is here no mangala, no auspicious gesture, which would be greater than having, and this is a reference, this Dardava Pavitrapani, will be remembered from this famous passage in the Mahābhāṣya, where we have this statement that Pāṇini is the authority, right? That Pāṇini is the Pramada Bhutaha, Acharya Dharva Pavitra Panehi Suchavakashe Pranmukha Ashima Mahata Yatnena, what is it? Suprisma Nayati. Nayatisma. So this has to do with Pāṇini. When he originally created his Ashtadhyayi, he did so with kind of great effort, and he did so with the sacred Dharva grass in hand, facing east. And he created his great work with this tremendous effort. And then in the context of the Mahābhāṣya, this is where he says, okay, then how can we believe that a single akshara would be meaningless or without purpose in Pāṇini's grammar, let alone an entire sutra. So it seems to be that what he's saying is that even though we don't have an explicit namaskara or mangala shloka or something in these Kāśikāvṛtti, we have nonetheless this sort of initial gesture that was performed by Pāṇini at the very start of the grammatical composition. And this might be considered to be superior to anything else. Yes, so maybe we can give my voice a break for a little bit, and we can maybe take a few questions about either the verses or about any of the other things that I have mentioned up to this point. I don't know, I will delegate this to task to Lydia. I hope it's not.
No, that's fine. So like we said, we're not using chat for questions. Well, I've got some questions here on the Slido, and once again, making sure that everyone knows that that's where we're taking the questions. But if you'd like to ask a question in the group and it's really, really important, then you can of course also try to put your hand up, I think. I should be able to see that. But yes, in any case, sorry, I'm losing that, the question. So first, actually, there's a question that takes us back to the kind of first things you were talking about, and I like to bring it up because I'm a great fan of Colebrooks. Actually, that was one of my
Yes.
the alternate topic of my PhD. And I just wanted to ask, I mean, reading this question out loud by anonymous, so we don't know who asked it, but where did Colebrooke get this information? And how was it possible for someone in 1905 to collect this list? Was he?
I'm sorry, I was seeing if I have the book. No, but the book on Colebrooke by the Rochers that will give you the answer to all of these questions. He did work, of course, with pundits. I mean, he had several pundits that he worked with. He had, I mean, he requested that he wanted to learn. He was incredibly engaged in a variety of topics in Sanskrit. And I mean, if you look at the earlier volumes of Asiatic researches, he has a tremendous number of essays dealing with the Vedas and dealing with all kinds of topics, including grammar and including metrics, for example, Sanskrit poetry. So he asked and he was interested, and there were people there who knew, and so that's, I think, but they can give you, the Rochers will give you more, or Lydia, if you know more. I don't remember.
No, I would only suggest that.
One pundit in particular, I don't remember his name, but I think there was one in particular that he worked very closely with. And he, I mean, I remember in the Rochers, he did quite a bit of some traveling within India as well. And so he was able to collect things in that manner.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And then there are two questions which basically I think are very related, also by anonymous and anonymous number 2. Which one of them asks about the relationship then, I mean, I guess this is related to what you were saying about Haradatta's kind of takes, and other grammarians' takes on this incorrect usage that Kavis were presenting in their works. And so one question is about then the Kavi's relationship to grammar. Does this say anything about that relationship that the Kavis had to, let's say, a formal Pāṇinian grammar? And connected to that, would you say that this is correct, that Kavis often took great pride in introducing usages which rely only on very obscure Pāṇinian rules? And then what, you know, yeah, I think the same basically question.
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know, I guess the one that definitely, I mean, there's definitely, you can definitely see Pāṇinians playing with using rules, and more so as the later we go on. And I mean, somebody like Magga is clearly doing it left and right. And already in Ashwagosha, we see sections where he sort of goes through various strange forms, or showing off desiderative things like that, reduplicated eris. So yeah, I mean, I mean, it depends on which poet you're talking about, and the later we go, I think the more we see of this. I think Kalidasa probably did it in a more I don't know, discreet way, less ostentatious maybe than someone like Magga. But I think he did kind of leave maybe some puzzles here and there, quite intentionally for the reader. I think this Udayati by Magga, I think he really did intend people to be sort of puzzled by it, and dare to explain it maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is a question, I think maybe genuinely sometimes, well, I don't know. I mean, we sort of, I am in the process of kind of documenting how much this actually occurs, what poets would have known at the time. I mean, so one of the issues with Kalidasa and with Bharavi and to a lesser extent with Magadha, is that we have very little kind of, at least Pāṇinian literature. So if we think about Pāṇinian grammar in the first millennium, we actually don't have a terribly large amount. If the Mahābhāṣya is sort of in the BCE, we then basically have Bhaṭṭojī within the Pāṇinian tradition, and then the Kāśika. And that's kind of it. So what was there, or I guess Vrishabhadeva as well on the Vakyapedia first kanda. So what were they reading? What did they know? Did they take into consideration any of these other non-Pāṇinian grammars? Chandra vyākaraṇa, Jainendra vyākaraṇa. What role did they play? Would they have cared? Would they have read them? There are just a lot of unknowns. And sometimes I think from certain usages here and there, maybe they did know these other grammars, maybe they were willing to accept their authority, maybe they really just were swatantra, maybe they prided themselves on being able to bend the rules. And I mean, they're not making huge grammatical errors. I mean, it's not like first year Sanskrit students doing composition or something. I mean, they're usually these very subtle mistakes that creep in. But there was a concern from the time of, in Alankara Shastra, from the time of Bhāmaha and Vamana, at least.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that there's also such a disconnect in what we know right now about the connections between Alankara Shastra and Bhāmaha, who I was going to mention, and the Pāṇinians, but also people like Bhaṭṭi, where he's got this whole, that's a 7th century more or less poem, a proper kavya, but there's so much grammar in it, but it's such a mixed bag of parts Pāṇini, parts something Katantra-like, but then parts, something completely his own. So it's really difficult, probably.
Yeah, there's even, actually I was discussing this with one of my students, and he pointed out there's also in the Bhatti Kavya, you have this with Grahayatum. You have, I think it's in an aorist form though. You have this same usage with it being taking the agents in. Yeah. So you can sort of infer maybe what they accepted, but they're usually not, they don't tell us exactly who they were reading, or, but we can sort of make some inferences here and there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just checking the Slido again. Okay, and we've got Rajaram Venkataramani, who's asking, actually, should we try to unmute you? If I can find you, let me just see. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure, I can. Yeah.
Oh.
Are you able to hear me? Or?
Yes.
So, I mean, my question was about the usages. Hello. The usages like patha instead of pathyav. Is it peculiar to rishis, or is it something to do with the dating of the text? The more ancient the text, do you find more chandas-like usages, or?
Well, I mean, there's quite a lot of intentionally non-Pāṇinian texts out there that we know. Okay, I mean, it depends on what we, I guess I would, in the Western Academy, we would say these are all human written texts, so people are intentionally doing certain strange things. So in tantric texts, right, they sort of have their own non-Pāṇinian Arsha or Aisha dialects. Bhagavata Purana, which famously has a lot of very Vedic like usages throughout. So they continue, this is, I think, basically a question of genre, and it's a genre that continues to be active for quite some time. And so there are people, because they're writing in that genre, I think, felt they could take the license, because it was part of how a sort of Arsha text, a text by a rishi, should sound. And that was sort of part of the linguistic idiom that they were intentionally using. So I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but it's something that continues to happen in Sanskrit, in certain varieties of Sanskrit, from the very beginning up to fairly recent times, I guess.
Okay, so I don't have any more questions on Slido. Perhaps we'll collect some more for the second half. Yes, and we have a thank you in chat. So thank you, Rajaram. Yes, Victor, if were you ready to go into Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa?
Yeah, that would be great. Okay. So Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa or Śeṣa Krishna, I think as he's usually, you usually see it. So this is another, well, I think as I mentioned, we sort of saw his name pop up in Colebrook's list of texts. And it was popped up in association with a text called the Prakriyākaumudī of Rāmacandra. So Śeṣa Krishna is reported to be the guru of Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita. And this is a very famous debate. So Madhav Deshpande has written, looked into some of this sort of beginning to, it's really a very, there's sort of tons of material on this, and we're sort of just beginning to look into this and write about it, I think, at least in English. Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita's, if Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa was Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita's teacher, some people have said, other sources say that he was the Padama guru with Videshwara intervening. But in any case, Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita certainly was in the Śeṣa lineage, and he basically at some point broke off from it. So we'll come to this in a second. But Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa, or Śeṣa Krishna, was an intellectual giant of the 16th century. He, his name pops up in all kinds of sort of official briefs that were being sent out of Varanasi back to Mahābhāṣya. He wrote extensively on grammar. He wrote extensively he wrote kavya, he wrote an āhnika, he wrote this Kamsavada, which we'll come to in a little bit, or we'll see a verse from actually in a little bit. He wrote on what is Shujachara Shiromani. This was I mentioned here a dissertation by Benke. That's on this text sort of dealing with the place of Shudra within the ritual and the Brahmanical value system, I guess. Yeah, but he's sort of most famously, or not so famously maybe, known as Bhaṭṭoji's teacher. And so he would have taught Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita presumably using this work that I mentioned before, the Prakriyākaumudī of Rāmacandra. So at the beginning I mentioned that there's this Yenakshara Samamnayam verse, perhaps comes from a work called the Rupavatara by Dharmakirti. And this is, I think as many of you know, a way of presenting the Ashtadhyayi that is somehow more user-friendly, that goes according to Prakarana, that goes according to topic and does not follow the Sutra Pata. So I think many of you who have studied Sanskrit grammar have probably encountered the Śabdakaustubha, but prior to that there was this a series of other grammars in this same style, both Pāṇinian and non-Pāṇinian. Actually, one of the very first ones might well have been a recast of the Jainendra vyākaraṇa. But this type of way of presenting grammar was very popular, and up to Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita's time, the main work that was used within the Pāṇinian school was Rāmacandra's Prakriyākaumudī. And so Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita has really sort of copied a lot from that in his Śabdakaustubha. But of course, so we know the Śabdakaustubha is rather short. The explanations are kind of, just short and sweet and enough to get you to introductory student to understand the gist of the sutra. But in sort of longer works, like the Padamañjarī and Śabdakaustubha, Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita goes into more detail. So the sort of parallel for that within the Prakriyākaumudī would have been two commentaries that we know there were more. Some are still not published yet, but these other commentaries would have been elaborated much in the same way as the Śabdaratna or whatever, not Śabdaratna, but the Śabdenu Shekara or the Padamañjarī. they elaborate on this very rather terse commentary by Rāmacandra, and two of them are now published. One is by his grandson Viṭṭala, and the other one is by Śeṣa Krishna. The Viṭṭala's commentary is called the Prasada, and Krishna Śeṣa's commentary is called the Prakāśa. And he's incredibly important for the tradition because he, not only was the teacher of Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita, but he sort of had this, I think, very a great influence on how later grammarians were trying to sort of go back and correct the interpretation of Pāṇini's grammar, especially with reference to the authority, the ultimate authority of Patañjali. And so the way that this authority sort of develops is rather subtle over time, and we sort of get eventually to the stage of Nagesha, where we really can't do anything, even if Patanjali's silent, we then can't sort of use our own ideas to interpret Pāṇini. We have to have some basis for this in the Mahābhāṣya. And so some of this obviously is there in Haradatta, but Krishna Śeṣa, or Śeṣa Krishna, really I think was instrumental in sort of getting this going, and in some ways to his own detriment, because it's then Bhaṭṭojī who in his Padamañjarī comes back and attacks his teacher's views. And for this, he's taken to task by the famous Jagannatha Pandita Raja, and also in another work by Chakrapani, where they really are quite upset with Bhaṭṭojī for going against his teacher. This debate has been, or at least the outlines of the debate, or sort of the social impact of the debate, has been detailed by Madhav Deshpande in one of his great articles. And it's really a shame for us as sort of modern vyākaraṇa scholars that this commentary, the Prakāśa, was published really, really late. I mean, it did not come out until the end of the 70s and wasn't finished till 1980. So it's a work that we really desperately need to take into consideration when we study Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita, when we look at the developments of Pāṇinian grammatical debates. So we won't look at any particular, I mean, right, it's always very difficult to explain any subtle Pāṇinian debate to a more general audience. But we can at least get some idea of how Śeṣa Krishna presents himself and his work. And one of the goals of his works, as he sort of not so subtly says, is to, once again, correct preceding commentaries. And he sort of also really singles out Viṭṭala, although never by name. He not only does that, and we must also remember, as I said at the beginning, they're quite interested in getting rid of a lot of this other non-Pāṇinian grammar stuff. So things that have crept in, especially through the Vopadeva. So Vopadeva in this Mugdha Bodha is often comes under attack from people like Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita and Krishna Śeṣa. This is, of course, a very different stance on what is taken, as is known, I think, from a few articles now, by this Narayana Bhatta in his Prakriyākaumudī, a work that was written almost, I think, simultaneously, maybe a little bit before this Śabdakaustubha, where he has this very inclusive approach to grammar. He's, saying, even has an independent treatise on the authoritativeness of the non-Pāṇinian schools, the Apāṇiniya, Pramanya, Sadhana. So Krishna Śeṣa really seems to be one of the people that was very active in reestablishing or putting on very firm footing Pāṇinian grammar according to Patanjali. And his work, we know we know a lot about him. And we know that this work, the Prakāśa, was written at the behest of a particular king, Viravada, in Patrapunja, in the Doab. And we know, as I said, you should look at this dissertation. Other people have written about Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa as well, but I think the Benkei dissertation gives, at least up to that point in time, more or less a fairly extensive bibliography. We also know quite a lot about him because he has written quite a number of over 40 opening verses. So he has sort of, normal Mangala Charanas, and he sort of describes the lineage, the backgrounds of the kingdom, and then zooms in eventually to his particular king Viravada and his son Kalyana, who he's writing the commentary for. So I would like to try and read maybe 32, I believe, through 46 of these verses. This is just a small, we're obviously leaving out the initial 31, but these are very important, I think, verses for understanding the persona of Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa, and as well as his sort of approach to Sanskrit grammar. One of the great things, or one of the reasons that I would also really like to read these, is that the text that we have, so the Prakāśa was printed along with the Mula Grantha in the Saraswati Bhamana Grantha Mala, but we're able to really actually improve the text if we take into consideration the verses that, as Krishnamacharya prints them in his descriptive catalog. So, right, in a lot of these manuscript catalogs, they'll often print the beginning of the text. Krishnamacharya prints the beginning of the Prakāśa, and he prints it with a number of readings that are superior to what we find in the actual edition. So this is exciting, I think. I don't think anyone has, well, as I say, I'm indebted to Harnaga Isaacson for bringing this to my attention. And I don't think in other places where I've seen these verses quoted, I don't think people have taken into consideration how we might be able to improve text. Okay, so having said all of that, we can hopefully read through these if my voice holds out. I need to get one other thing up. Yeah, okay, so we're basically at this point at 31. The tasya here that the verse begins with, this refers back to the king. And we're going to basically learn a bit about his son, and then we're going to go on and learn a bit more about the composition of the commentary, how it's going to improve upon the later texts, and then ultimately kind of, much like Haradatta, Śeṣa Krishna is kind of quite proud of himself, so we'll also see some of this Atmastuti throughout. Okay, so Tasyasti Sarva Janalochana Lobanaya Saundarya Sarasa Vilasa Nivasa Bhumi Vidya Vinoda Parimodita Bhorisuri Kalyana Ityabi Dhaya Tanayo Nayangyaha. So Tasya, that is to say Viravarasya, he has a son, Tanya, who is wise and polity, who knows Niti Shastra and such. He goes by the name of Kalyana iti Abhidhaya. He is Saundarya Sara Savilasa, I believe maybe the Padacheda must be Saundarya Sara Savilasa Nivasa Bhumihi. He is the sort of foundation, the correct place for a pleasure house, of the essence of beauty, for pleasing or for delighting Lobanaya. Here we have a variant reading as well with Lobaniya in compounds, but maybe the dative is good too. For sort of delighting the eyes of all people, Sarvajana Lochana. He is one by whom a great number of learned men, Bodhisurihi, are thoroughly delighted because of his vidya vinoda, because of his pleasure that he takes in learning. Okay, so he's a very learned son. And now we get a further description of the son, Yasya, going Yasya, and then then there's kind of a nice pun or sort of joke that we have. As we'll see, there'll be a number of feminine, grammatically feminine things that belong to the son, and then at the end we get this question, Bhaṭṭa katham strainaha kumaru. Yes. Okay, so the verse in full. Yasya panga tarangite sura gavi vaktre cha vakchatari kante chapi saraswati hradi harer bhuktischa shaktir boje aste pani tale sada vitarana shrif pada padman ripa shreni mali mani prabha bhatta katham strainah kumaru pyasau. So he is one who has, in the sort of wandering about of his sidelong glance, there dwells, aste, there sits, sada, always, suragavi, so this would be the Kamadhenu, the cow of the gods. That means basically that, so she's the wish-fulfilling cow, and so wherever his wandering gaze, sidelong glance might go, he too will be wish-fulfilling, and seems to be the idea. So he will look this way, he will look that way, and much like there'll always be the Kamadhenu in his glance, and he will always then grant the wishes of his subjects. And then this is, I think, rather typical. The next two, Vaktre, in his mouth, there is the skillfulness of speech. So once again, a feminine chaturi, vakchaturi, feminine in his vaktra, in his mouth. And in his throat, there of course sits Saraswati. And in his heart, there's the devotion, bhakti, once again feminine, to Hari, to Vishnu. In his arms, there is strength. And in the palm of his hand, there is also always the wealth for Vitarana. Vitarana here is something like the donations for his generosity. So he always has sort of sufficient money in hand to give away. And in his lotus feet, or his lotus, okay, probably feet, we should understand there is the brilliance, the prabha, the shining of the jewels, the crown jewels of the rows of kings. So once again, this standard image that he is, many of his subordinate kings are bowing down to him, and the light shines off from their row of crowns onto his feet. So there's always this prabha. And then he says, Bhaṭṭa katham straina kumaru pyasau. So that one, even though he's sort of this young prince man, how is it that he's, how so that he is also, okay, straina, meaning feminine or so. There are many actual ways we can derive straina in Pāṇinian grammar. Stribhya agatam would be one way. Stribhyohitam would be another way. Tasya apatyam, that is born from. So he's maybe, we could, if we take it however we want to take the tarita suffix, he's maybe feminine in that he's, or existing, you could even say, strishu bhavaha. So he is somehow, he's pervaded by women, it seems, even though he is a young man prince. So a bit of a joke, a grammatical joke there. Okay, and then the next one is we come to is also a verse that we find in the Kamsavada. So this is a Natika that Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa has written. I think it was this one. I mean, I'll have to double, something seems a bit off there. In any case, I'll double check. So then the next one has to do with why the prince, or that the prince has decided to really engage in Sanskrit grammar. So he's really wise, but he chooses Sanskrit grammar as the thing that he is particularly interested in. So sarva vidya vidopyasya kalyana guna shalina avinya vishitativa tikshna vyākaraṇe mati. So the mind of this prince, of a prince, even though he knows all of the sciences, and he is, of course, endowed with all of the excellent virtues. Okay, he plays with this kalyana for a little while in some later verses. His sharp mind, so even though he knew all of these things, his sharp mind was particularly dedicated to abhinya vishita ativa, was particularly dedicated to, was particularly engrossed in vyākaraṇa, in grammar. And then the next one is quite nice. I believe this is the one, yeah, sorry, this is the one that should be with the Kamsavada. This one is very nice. Well, okay, this is one where he's clearly referencing, I think, as you can see, a rather famous verse from the Kavya Darshan, from Dundan's Kavya Darshan. And this has to do with an idea that I guess sort of came up earlier, that grammatically correct speech is really necessary for poetic composition, and that regardless of whatever else you do, however else you might make your speech, if it lacks grammar, it's not going to do the trick. It's not going to please sajjanas, wise and good people. So this one goes. Rasa lankara sarapi vane vyakarano jita shwitropahata gatreva naranjayati sajjanam. So speech, vani, even though it has as its very core rasa, emotional, aesthetic flavor, and alankaras, ornaments, if it is devoid of grammar, if it is if it is given up on grammar, it will not please, it will not delight good people, much as it were a woman whose body or limbs are struck down with leprosy. So this same idea is given in the Kavya Darshan parallel that I give here in the footnote. So let the body syadvapu sundaram. So even a body that is beautiful would be impossible to enjoy because of a single shvitra, of a single leprous spot. So he really wants to be a scholar, he wants to be a very learned prince and then king, but he has to have good grammar because he knows that he's not going to please the sajjanas without perfecting his speech, and not simply ornamenting it, but making sure that its very core, its very body is in line with vyākaraṇa. So now we get one where you can see that he plays quite a bit with this word kalyana, with his name. And he begins to explain how he came to write the Prakāśa. So kalyanasya tanud bhavasya nripater kalyana murtes tata kalyanim matim akalaya vishamagrantarta samvittaye Kṛṣṇam Śeṣa nrsimha suri tanayam Shri Prakriyākaumudī tikam kartum asau vishesha vidusham prityai samajinyapat. Okay, so the main verb would be that the king, commanded Krishna, that is Śeṣa Krishna, the son Śeṣa Nrsimha Suri. Okay, so this is going to be his father, obviously, Nrsimha of the Śeṣa lineage. He commanded him for the enjoyment of all learned people to write, that king commanded him for the enjoyment of all, for the delight of all learned people, to make a commentary on the Shri, the holy Prakriyākaumudī. After doing what? So I think maybe we take Krishna perhaps as the agent of akalaya. So after something like inspiring, after compelling this beautiful, wonderful, excellent mind to engage deeply with difficult, the meaning of difficult texts, the mind of whom? The mind of Kalyana, who was the son of the king, and who was, well, I don't know, maybe like auspiciousness incarnate, or who had a beautiful form, something like that. So the prince is now inspired to study very difficult texts, and then the king commands him to write a commentary on the Prakriyākaumudī. This is generally how the verse has been understood, that the SOAS is referring back to the king, and that he is then commanding Krishna to write the commentary. Maybe there are other possibilities. Akalaya, I would also take as having as its main agent Krishna. Okay, maybe if it were the king, it would be a little bit strange that we have in the Nripati here, but maybe there are other ways of construing the agents. So the next one, this verse has been mentioned, it's mentioned, I think, in a couple of places. We have in the introduction to the Prasada, and it's also mentioned by Madhav Deshpande. This is one that was quite corrupt, it seems, in the printed edition, but it's one where it looks like he is openly attacking another commentary, probably the Prasada of Rāmacandra's grandson, Vittala. So we can look at this here, and then we can look perhaps at the what was printed, and sort of there seem to probably still be some textual issues, or maybe some not entirely sure yet of the exact interpretation. So asputa bhava prasputa dosha vihitapa siddhanta asamartaka padabandha naisha parata vibhavayatyartam. So if we take it like this, what he seems to be saying is that this, he is presumably not referring back to his own commentary, but maybe this sort of pre-existing commentary in which the bhava, the sort of essential meaning, is not clear, in which the faults are very clear, in which apa siddhantas, bad, incorrect siddhantas have been stated, and in which there is the sort of composition of ineffectual words. This maybe tika that has gone before, it does not bring out in a superior manner. Aparata, this is where one of the variant readings we have, does not bring out or make clear the artha, the meaning of the Prakriyākaumudī. We can just maybe look very briefly. 46. Yeah, so the as printed in the edition, it's clearly unmetrical, and there clearly some things just don't make good sense. The other, so this is from the introduction to the Prakriyākaumudī by Trivedi with the Prasada commentary, and here we have Naisha Param Bhavayatyartam. This also metrically does not quite work out. So I think we're missing two more. But somehow that it does not make clear the maybe pada artha is maybe not so bad, but yeah, well, maybe somebody will have some suggestions later on as to what the best interpretation of the verse would be. But I think we can really, we've really improved from this original reading that we have in the printed edition to a more sensible verse, even if, well, at least I'm not 100% sure of each thing. Maybe there's some comments and people that know what's happening. Yeah, but in general, this is taken to refer to be some sort of slight against the prasada, which he then, as I said, will criticize throughout the commentary. Okay, so he gets the command. He is told to write the commentary. He says that, or maybe we can think of the king as saying this, you know, that this commentary here before me is not really up to snuff. And so that's maybe one way, if we think of it as sort of this is what the king maybe said, or this is what Śeṣa Krishna said to the king. And then in the next one, we get how he's going to write the commentary. And we get a number of interesting words. Once again, we can see here bhāṣya, and also this term here, āhnika sakshikam, we'll talk about. But these are rather key words as to how he is going to write his commentary and why it is going to be superior to the other ones. So tasmat viravaran mahisha mukuta lankara chudam manehe prapyagnya suchiram vibhavya cha hradi jyotir nrsimhabhidam santoshaya vishishya bhashya virusham bodhaya dormedhasam vyakyam yakara sakshikam suvishadam tam prakriyākaumudī. So the basic structure is I explain, I will comment upon and explain this Prakriyākaumudī in Suvishadam, okay, very clearly. And Akara Sakshikam, if we take this as sort of an avibhava adverbial compound, in action of vyākaraṇa, in which the witnesses, or the witness, it has as its witness the akara. Akara here, I mean, if you look in Update, you also find akara as a meaning for the Mahābhāṣya, but it means, okay, of course it can mean something like a mine, but it can mean something like the source text. So it probably means something like he's going to explain it, and he's going to keep or quotes or make sure he has them as his witness to his commentary, these earlier texts, or something like, I mean, it's almost like, okay, I'm going to quote proper footnotes and my resources and such. So why is he going to do this? He's going to do this for the pure delight, especially for the delight of people who know, who are learned vidvats in the bhāṣya. Okay, also to help not so smart people understand. He is going to do this after having done what? After having received the command from the king, okay, who is maybe the crown jewel of all of the ornaments for the crowns of all of the kings. Once again, this idea that he is the best of all of the kings. And after meditating vibhavya upon the light that goes by the name of Nrsimha in his heart. Okay, so once again, this Vaishnava affiliation. So I think these two are really sort of key. Once again, we have the mention of the bhāṣya, and we have this mention of having sort of your main source text present. We are at 7:08. I think if we, well, one, I think I might end up losing my voice if we continue through all of them, but also we might end up going over time. Maybe there are one or two, maybe we can do some of the, skip a few. Which one to skip though? Well, maybe I can sort of summarize a few, and then skip ahead a little bit. Well, maybe we'll just continue on, because all of them are sort of interesting and I think important. But maybe we'll skip to the last one as we come closer to the end. So we continue to get some sort of statement about how why and how he is composing the commentary. I maybe have some doubts or questions about one or two things towards the end. Hopefully we can talk about that as well. So he says, Pracham suchata suchatarita gahane vacham prapanchedya nash chetash chanchadata vimoha vidaram chintam chiram chumbati kamam kintu nirasta vistaram iha prastutya mulam shishutrasan yasi maya mitam hitam iha nuktam viviktam cha yat. So our mind, chetaha, which is free of, okay, so it's not wandering about, it's not fickle, and it's also free of moha, of delusion. For some time, it is kissing, that is, it is in contact with concern, chintam, or with thought. Now, about the prapancha, about the full expanse, the sort of a very elaborate expanse of statements of the preceding grammarians. And this full expanse of their statement is sort of rife with, is thick with meanings, maybe very su-uchita, very correct meanings, but very correct meanings which are only suchita, which are only hinted at. That is to say that they're not explicitly stated. So if we think about how we analyze the Mahābhāṣya, this requires quite a lot of explanation. And this is the type of thing that would maybe cause concern to his mind. Okay, so be it, but I'm still going to take up prastutya, this root text here. Which, so if we're thinking back to the Prakriyākaumudī, it is nirasta vistara. Okay, so it's sort of not extremely expansive. It's not extremely long. It has been, it's vistara, all of this sort of extra stuff has been thrown out. And out of concern for the children, shishutrasat, I have placed down, I have composed something beneficial. Here, hitam, mitam, measuredly, namely what is not been stated in the root text, perhaps, and also what is the victim. Maybe we can take the victim here as something as not sort of discrete or different, but something as like profound or very learned. So this is what he has done now. So nyasi, this being ni, us in the passive aorist, by me. And he's done it out of sort of concern for the children, and he's worried about how difficult it is perhaps to make sense of this vast expanse of information that is not explicitly stated in the statements of his earlier sources. This one was also kind of funny. We'll do this one, maybe then we'll skip to the last one. So dustarka karkasha dhyam vidusham mitoktya nishesha dosha pari shosha mritte natosha hantabi nindati na manda matir bahuktav tatkena vani karavani jananu vrittim. Okay, this is kind of funny. So the gist is that you can't please everyone. So there is no delight, natosha, for learned men, vidusham, whose minds have become maybe something like calloused, almost, have become harsh or rough from dustarka. This is maybe not, I think if you look this up, you'll find something like bad arguments, but this is maybe something that is very difficult to be argued in that sense. So their minds are very rough from always dealing with things that are so difficult to reason out. They're impossible to really make sense of. So these types of people, they will not be satisfied with mitoktya, with measured statements, with short statements, without purely drying up or destroying all faults. So they really want the full explanation. They want as much as they can get. They want every possible problem to be dealt with in full, otherwise they will not be happy. But, damn it, Hanta, the slow-witted, they're not going to be happy with too much verbosity, bahukti. So they're not going to be delighted when there's a lot of speech. So by what means then, O speech, can I make a jananuvritti, something that will be in sort of in accordance with, that is pleasing to, or in the, with all people. So what could I do possibly that would then follow in the idea of what everyone wants, is the main idea. Maybe we can, well, I guess we should at least do the last one. So this sort of is a jab at his possible detractors. Hivaki bhavat idha ched aham yordosham mrisha pashyati nistushe pi kim tatra kormo mridalam dukulam chen mushiko dushayati dushanaham. So I think, yeah. So if an arrogant person, ahamyu, sees in vain a fault, even in something that is absolutely pure, because of there being somebody who is, I don't know, Hevaka is not a terribly common word. You find it glossed with abhilasha, maybe something, I think we find it translated in the Kutinimita as whim. So because they are whimsical, because they're acting on a whim, something like that. So if they sort of try and find faults on a whim, even it's in vain, because even in the perfectly good work. Kim tatra korma, what am I to do in that case? If a mouse, a wicked mouse, should spoil a fine, pure white cloth. So that's sort of his, he's going to sort of make attacks against everybody else's work, but his own work, it's really quite pure. And if you do try and to attack it, you'll basically compare to this sort of wicked mouse gnawing at a very fine garment. Okay, I think that's more than enough time and more than enough than my voice can kind of handle. Sorry we didn't get quite through everything that I had hoped, but I hope I will be able to present these in a better format with translation in the not too distant future. So thank you very much. Any questions and comments and improvements are very welcome.
Okay, so thank you so much. I'm just going to come in with a question from Odile, who asked about the importance of using different meters. And I would like to add on to that my kind of comment or remark that these are really good poets. I mean, Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa, he's an ornate poet, but he's a really, really good ornate kavya poet. I mean, the kind of yamakas he uses, the nice anuprasas, the way he fills out Shabdula Vikridita verse, it just all makes sense if we can get to that sense. But it doesn't feel like everything is metrikauza, you know, it's not all anushtup. I mean, can you just say a bit more about these authors as maybe composers of poetry?
Well, I think, I mean, for the meters, this is, well, if we're sort of progressing from Haradatta, and this was another reason to sort of look at Haradatta first. Haradatta, as we saw, okay, he's nowhere near as elaborate, but he does have whatever, 8 or 9, how many was it, 9? 8 verses. He does use Ratodata, he does use Arya, he does use Viyogini. So there's sort of, I think we can see sort of, maybe Śeṣa Kṛṣṇa was looking back to Haradatta in this regard. But it's, I think, quite standard at this time that you would write using all of these different meters. But him as a poet, I mean, this is, I don't know if people have looked at Kamsavada. I don't think this has been translated, but he clearly was a very gifted poet. And we sort of hear a lot about these very multifaceted intellectuals. In parts, we know that they're so multifaceted because time has not ravaged the manuscripts that contain their works. Maybe other people would have been equally as versatile, but he is, I think, quite unique in this regard. I mean, if we think of later grammarians, I don't think that Geshe has quite a number of nice verses ascribed to him, but Jagannatha, of course, he was a phenomenal poet, and he did write, as I mentioned, this work on grammar. But yeah, I mean, these poetic works, I think we have at least two that are surely ascribed to, or surely written by Śeṣa Krishna, others are maybe spurious. But he was just a phenomenal poet. And if you look actually into this scene where in the Kamsavada, where this verse is taken from about her being, you can't have a speech that's been marred by leprosy or something, by spots. There's sort of a longer dialogue about what it means to write in poetic language and how important it is for grammar. So I think we're just really fortunate to have enough works by him to see the breadth. And we're fortunate that he was sort of a talented poet as well as a grammarian.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'd also like to unmute, there's Dr. Prashant Dharmadhikari, who has a suggestion for one of the readings. So let's have a look.
Great, thank you, great.
Hello.
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 Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to share one alternative reading, if that is Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa's 31st verse. That is, Tasyasti sarvajana lochana lobhanaya saundarya sarasa vilasa nivasa bhumihi ya vinoda parimodita bhuri surihi kalyana ityabhidaya tanayo nayajnaha. So in the course of discussion, you were saying Saundarya Sara and then Savilasa Nivasa Bhumihi. That is one. Another one that I wish to suggest is Saundarya Sarasa. Sarasa is the name of a bird. Saundarya Sarasa Vilasa Nivasa Bhumihi. Saundarya Sarasa Vilasa. It means the Vilasa of a Saundarya Sarasa. Tathacha Vilasa Nivasa. Sarasasya vilasah, sarasasya nivasah iti. That is one we can say. So we can relate with the meaning, and it can be beautified more. That is my interpretation.
But what does it mean to be what does it mean to be a vilasa? What is a vilasa nivasa for a sadasa bird?
I think the sarasa. Saundarya Sarasa
is this
Saundarya Sarasasya Vilasa. That is the Shashti, Shashti, Vibhakti. Saundarya Sarasasya Vilasa Sarasasya Nivasa Bhumihi. Vilasa Bhumihi, Nivasa Bhumihi. Can we say like that? Hello?
Yes.
That is something that I was.
I mean, as I said. Yeah, I was this sadasa. I was not happy with anything that I could really think of, or with the Padacheda. I'm not sure what it would mean if it is the bird. I mean that yeah. Okay. I wasn't sure if this was a Kavi Samaya or something that I was missing, or what exactly it would mean with sadasa as the bird.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Right, and we have a question in the Slido, which I'll just read out if you don't mind, Patty, because we're short on time. But so the question is, to what extent have you found the introductory verses you've studied to say things about the personality or ego of the author compared to the thinking on grammar?
Well, I think these two in particular have been very fruitful in terms of revealing their personality. I think both of them, and I think there maybe is a connection in some ways between Haradatta and Śeṣa Kṛṣṇa. I don't think we have any later grammarians, Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita, I don't think, Mangesha don't have quite so many verses. I mean, up in the 40s, certainly not. The other one where we do reveal some more information, personal information, I think, is if we look at Narayana Bhatta's Prakriyākaumudī. So he also has sort of programmatic verses where we learn more about him and more about his sort of grammatical philosophy. For the other ones, they're all quite, I mean, the Śabdakaustubha, of course, begins very, with this very short homage to the Muni Trayam, and then Taduktif Paribhavyacha. And this is something that Mara Deshpande has written about, if I can find it quickly. It seems to be echoing a verse in here. Where did it go? Yes, where he says, Chiram Maduktif Paribhavaniya. So there is, I think, a very distinct, very clear echo in the beginning of the Śabdakaustubha with this here. And you see, okay, the whole thing's rather complicated because it depends on what you believe Tat refers back to, and there's sort of a split in Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita's verse where whether the Tat goes back to the Muni Triya or it goes back to or refers to earlier grammarians, and then how to understand Paribhavya in that verse. But in any case, it seems here, this one we didn't get to, that Śeṣa Kṛṣṇa is very interested that people study or take into consideration his own speech, whereas when we go to Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita, if we understand Tat as the going back, Muni Trayasya Uktihi Paribhavyacha, and Paribhavya in a positive sense, not Tiraskarya, then we see a very clear shift in the way that Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita sort of is not one of these very, well, I don't want puffed up maybe like Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa, but he's more interested in people studying the statements of the Muni Trayam, whereas Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa would be more, seems to be more directed towards his own greatness.
Okay, thanks. And then can I just ask, out of curiosity, in your estimation, then, is the Prakāśa actually pleasing to all? Have you read through it and thought that yes, Kṛṣṇa Śeṣa did actually achieve his amazingly lofty goal?
I mean, he, I think, did achieve quite a lot, and I haven't read. I mean, I always feel like I should always start everything, but I know nothing. I mean, all of these works on Pāṇinian grammar, of course, are incredibly long. I mean, he doesn't, the Prakriyākaumudī does not include all of the sutras, but I have found it to be incredibly interesting for the history of grammar. And his explanations are, for the most part, well, they're very thorough, and they're been very illuminating as to how we get from maybe Haradatta or Kayata to Bhaṭṭojī Dīkṣita and then to Nagesha. So they really have been, at least for me, okay, I've both enjoyed them as being very nice explanations, and I've enjoyed them as being an important part of the history of Sanskrit grammar. So I think he did do quite a good job.
So you weren't feeling any particular shishutrasa as you were going through it, and
well, I always feel that, I think. Study, if they have to study grammar, but no, I think he really pulled off well, and I hope maybe other people will take up studying this work in more detail.
Hopefully. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm turning off the recording.